The black sedan pulled up to the grand entrance of Harmony Music Hall on a crisp Tuesday morning. Richard stepped out, adjusting his expensive silk tie and smoothing down his perfectly styled hair. At 45, he was everything you'd expect. From a world-famous pianist. His shoes cost more than most people's monthly rent, and his watch gleamed under the morning sun like a tiny beacon of wealth. Richard had arrived early for his monthly master class, something he'd been doing for the past 3 years at various prestigious venues across the country. Today's session would be filled with eager young musicians, all hoping to catch a glimpse of genius at work. He thrived on these moments, basking in the admiration and awe that followed him wherever he went. Walking through the ornate lobby, Richard nodded curtly to the security guard and headed straight for the main performance hall. The place was magnificent, with its soaring ceilings, crystal chandeliers, and rows of plush red velvet seats. But what really caught his attention was the centerpiece, a stunning Steinway concert grand piano that sat on stage like a sleeping giant. Richard approached the piano with the reverence of a knight approaching his sword. He'd played on hundreds of pianos throughout his career, but each one was different. Each had its own personality, its own quirks that needed to be understood and mastered. He lifted the lid and ran his fingers along the pristine black and white keys, testing their responsiveness. As he began his warm-up routine, playing scales and arpeggios with mechanical precision, he noticed movement in his peripheral vision. A woman in a simple gray uniform was quietly moving around the stage area, dusting and arranging chairs. She looked to be in her early 50s with graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. Her clothes were clean but clearly worn from years of use. Richard barely glanced at her as he continued his practice. To him, she was part of the background, like the furniture or the lighting fixtures. He launched into a particularly challenging passage from Rachmaninoff, his fingers flying across the keys in a display of technical prowess that had earned him standing ovations in concert halls around the world. But then something unexpected happened. As he reached a particularly difficult section, his finger positioning shifted slightly, creating a subtle but noticeable tension in the melody. It wasn't wrong exactly, but it wasn't quite right either. Any ordinary listener wouldn't have noticed, but apparently this cleaning lady did. "Excuse me," came a soft voice from behind him. Richard stopped playing and turned around, slightly annoyed at the interruption. The woman was standing a respectful distance away, her cleaning cloth still in hand. "I'm sorry to bother you," she continued, her voice gentle but clear, "but you might try relaxing your fourth finger just a little on that passage. It'll give you better control over the dynamics." Richard stared at her for a moment, not quite believing what he'd just heard. This woman, this janitor, was giving him advice about piano technique? Him? A man who had studied at the finest conservatories, who had won international competitions, who had performed with the world's most prestigious orchestras. "I beg your pardon?" he said, his voice carrying just a hint of ice. The woman seemed to realize she had overstepped. A slight blush colored her cheeks as she lowered her gaze. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt your practice. It's just that I've heard that piece played many times and I thought—" "You thought what exactly?" Richard's tone was becoming sharper now. "That someone who cleans floors for a living could teach a concert pianist how to play?" The woman's blush deepened, but she stood her ground. "I just noticed things, that's all. I've been working here for 15 years and I hear a lot of music." Richard let out a short laugh, but there was no humor in it. "Hearing music and understanding music are two very different things, my dear. I've spent my entire life studying this art form. I've dedicated decades to perfecting my technique." He turned back to the piano and played the passage again, deliberately using the same fingering as before. To his trained ear, it was perfectly acceptable. Maybe this cleaning lady had watched too many YouTube videos and thought she knew something about music there, he said, finishing the phrase with a flourish. "Perfect execution." The woman nodded slowly, but he caught something in her expression. Not admiration or apology, but something that looked almost like pity. The thought irritated him more than her initial comment had. "Of course," she said quietly. "I'm sure you know best." She resumed her cleaning, moving to dust the piano bench while Richard continued his warm-up. But now he found himself distracted. Every few minutes he'd glance over at her, watching as she worked with quiet efficiency. She hummed softly as she moved around the stage, and he couldn't help but notice that her humming was perfectly in tune. 20 minutes later, the first of his students began arriving. They were a mix of college-age musicians and serious adult learners, all paying substantial fees for the privilege of studying with him. Richard immediately switched into his teaching persona, greeting each student with carefully measured warmth and positioning himself as the benevolent master, sharing wisdom with the grateful masses. "Welcome, everyone," he announced as the last student took their seat in the front row. "Today we'll be exploring the nuances of romantic period composition, focusing on technical precision and emotional interpretation." He noticed the cleaning lady was still on stage, now arranging music stands near the piano. Her presence annoyed him. This was supposed to be an exclusive masterclass, not a public performance for the hired help. "Excuse me," he called out to her, his voice carrying clearly across the hall. "We're about to begin our session. Perhaps you could finish your work later." The woman looked up, clearly flustered. "Oh, of course, I'm almost done. Just give me one more minute." But Richard was feeling particularly pompous today. Something about her earlier comment had gotten under his skin, and he decided to make an example of her. After all, his students needed to understand the difference between real musical knowledge and amateur pretension. "Actually," he said, his voice taking on a theatrical quality, "since you seem to have opinions about piano technique, perhaps you'd like to demonstrate your expertise for our class?" The woman froze, her dusting cloth halfway to a music stand. No, that's not necessary. I should really get back to my work." But Richard was warming to his theme now. He could see his students shifting in their seats, some looking uncomfortable, others clearly curious about where this was going. "Oh, but I insist," Richard continued, his smile sharp as a blade. "You seemed so confident in your assessment of my playing earlier. Surely someone with such keen musical insight would be delighted to share their knowledge with aspiring musicians." The woman's face had gone pale, but there was something in her eyes now, a flicker of something that Richard couldn't quite identify. It wasn't fear exactly. It was more like determination. "I really don't think that would be appropriate," she said softly. "Nonsense." Richard clapped his hands together. "Music is for everyone, isn't that right? Even if some of us only encounter it while dusting piano keys." A few of his students chuckled nervously, clearly uncertain about their teacher's behavior, but afraid to speak up. The cleaning lady stood very still for a long moment, her eyes fixed on the piano. Then slowly, she set down her cleaning supplies and looked directly at Richard. "If you're sure that's what you want," she said quietly, and something in her voice made Richard feel for just a moment like he might have made a very big mistake. The silence in the concert hall stretched like a rubber band about to snap. Richard stood by the piano, his confident smile beginning to waver as he looked at the cleaning lady who had just accepted his challenge. Something about the way she had said those words, "if you're sure that's what you want," sent an unexpected chill down his spine. His students sat frozen in their seats watching this strange drama unfold. Most of them looked uncomfortable, sensing that their teacher might be crossing a line. But Richard was too caught up in his own ego to back down now. He had built his entire reputation on being the best, and he wasn't about to let some janitor make him look foolish. "Wonderful," he announced, clapping his hands together with forced enthusiasm. "This will be an excellent learning opportunity for everyone. We'll see the difference between someone who has dedicated their life to music and someone who has simply overheard it." The woman, he realized he didn't even know her name, walked slowly toward the piano. She moved with a quiet dignity that somehow made Richard feel smaller, though he couldn't understand why. Her uniform was simple and practical, her shoes worn from years of walking these halls. But there was something in her posture that didn't quite match her humble appearance. "What's your name?" asked one of the students, a young woman with kind eyes who seemed genuinely interested. "Carmen," the cleaning lady replied softly. "Carmen Rodriguez." "And how long have you worked here, Carmen?" Richard asked, his tone dripping with condescension. He wanted his students to understand exactly what they were witnessing, a perfect example of the difference between professional training and amateur delusion. 15 years, Carmen answered simply. 15 years of listening to real musicians practice, Richard said with a laugh. I suppose that might give someone the illusion that they understand music. Tell me, Carmen, what's the most complicated piece you've ever attempted? Mary Had a Little Lamb, perhaps? A few students shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Even they could sense that their teacher was being unnecessarily cruel, but Richard was too far gone to stop now. Carmen looked at him steadily. I used to play many pieces, she said quietly. But that was a long time ago. Used to play, Richard exclaimed, turning to his students as if he'd just heard the most amusing joke. You see, class? This is what happens when people confuse wishful thinking with actual ability. Carmen here used to play. I'm sure we've all used to play at some point, haven't we? But Carmen didn't rise to the bait. Instead, she simply asked, What would you like me to play? Richard rubbed his hands together, enjoying every moment of what he thought would be Carmen's humiliation. Oh, I think we should let you choose. After all, you did have the confidence to correct my technique earlier. Surely someone with such musical insight has a repertoire to draw from. Carmen was quiet for a long moment, her eyes fixed on the piano keys. I could play something simple, she offered. Something that won't take too much time away from your class. Nonsense, Richard waved his hand dramatically. This is education in action. My students need to understand what real musical training looks like versus, well, whatever it is you represent. Please choose anything you'd like. Don't hold back. On our account. The young woman who had asked Carmen's name earlier raised her hand tentatively. Maybe we should just continue with the lesson? I mean, if Carmen doesn't want to... Oh, but she does want to, Richard interrupted. Don't you, Carmen? After all, you were confident enough to give me advice. Surely you're not going to back down now. Carmen's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. For the first time since this whole scene began, Richard saw a flash of something in her eyes. Not anger exactly, but something deeper. Something that made him feel like he was standing on the edge of a cliff without realizing it. Actually, Carmen said, her voice still quiet but carrying a new undertone of steel, I think that's a fair request. If I'm going to offer advice about music, I should be willing to demonstrate what I mean. Richard felt a moment of unease, but he pushed it aside. What could this woman possibly do that would impress anyone? She cleaned floors for a living. The most she'd probably learned was how to plunk out a simple melody she'd heard the real musicians practicing. Excellent, he said, gesturing grandly toward the piano bench. The stage is yours, Carmen. Show us what 15 years of observation has taught you. Carmen approached the piano slowly, almost reverently. She ran her fingers along the edge of the keyboard, much the way Richard had done during his warm-up. But there was something different about her touch. Gentler, more knowing, like she was greeting an old friend. Actually, she said, turning back to Richard, I think it would be better if you played first. Show everyone how this piece should really sound. Then I'll try my best to follow your example. Richard's chest puffed with pride. An excellent idea. Lead by example, as they say. What piece would you like me to demonstrate? Carmen thought for a moment. Do you know Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, the first movement? Richard nearly laughed out loud. Do I know it? My dear woman, I've performed that piece with the London Symphony Orchestra. It's one of the most technically demanding pieces in the classical repertoire. Are you sure you want me to set the bar quite so high? I think your students would benefit from hearing it played properly, Carmen said simply. Indeed they would. Richard cracked his knuckles and adjusted the piano bench with theatrical precision. Class, what you're about to hear is the result of decades of intensive training, countless hours of practice, and an intimate understanding of musical interpretation that simply cannot be learned casually. He positioned his hands over the keys, feeling the familiar thrill that came before a performance. This would be perfect. A stunning display of technical mastery followed by Carmen's inevitable failure. His students would understand once and for all what separated the professionals from the pretenders. The Rachmaninoff Piano Concerto No. 2, he announced, is widely considered one of the most beautiful and challenging works ever written for piano. It requires not just technical skill but deep emotional understanding, precise timing, and years of study to truly master. Carmen nodded politely, but Richard caught something in her expression. Was that amusement? Impossible. She was probably just nervous about having to follow his performance. Pay close attention, class, Richard continued. Notice the fingerwork, the pedaling, the way I shape each phrase. This is what professional-level piano playing looks like. He took a deep breath, felt the familiar calm that came before a great performance, and began to play. The opening notes of the concerto filled the hall with their haunting beauty, and Richard lost himself in the familiar joy of creation. His fingers moved with practiced precision across the keys, every note exactly where it should be, every phrase shaped with mathematical perfection. But as he played, he found himself stealing glances at Carmen. She stood perfectly still, her eyes closed, her face peaceful. She wasn't watching his technique or marveling at his skill. She looked like she was listening to something else entirely, something beyond the notes he was playing. And for the first time in his career, Richard began to wonder if perfect technique was really enough. Richard's fingers danced across the piano keys with the precision of a master craftsman. Every note of the Rachmaninoff concerto rang out crystal clear, each phrase executed with textbook perfection. His years of training showed in every movement, the way his wrists stayed perfectly level, how his fingers curved just so, the careful control of the pedals beneath his feet. The students watched in obvious admiration. This was exactly what they had paid to see. A world-class musician demonstrating why he commanded such respect in the classical music world. Richard's technique was flawless, his timing impeccable. He navigated the most challenging passages without breaking a sweat, his face calm and focused as his hands moved with mechanical precision. But as beautiful as the music was, there was something almost cold about it. Every note was perfect, but somehow the performance felt more like a mathematical equation than an emotional journey. Richard played with his head, not his heart, delivering a technically superior but strangely distant interpretation of one of the most passionate pieces ever written. Carmen stood motionless throughout the entire performance, her eyes still closed, her face serene. She didn't seem impressed or intimidated by Richard's display of skill. If anything, she looked patient, like she was waiting for something. As Richard reached the climactic section of the first movement, his playing became even more precise, even more controlled. He wanted to leave no doubt about his superiority. Every run was clean, every chord perfectly balanced. This was professional level playing at its finest, technically flawless and absolutely unassailable. When the last notes faded into silence, the students burst into enthusiastic applause. Richard stood and took a theatrical bow, his face flushed with satisfaction. He had proven his point magnificently. Now Carmen would have to follow this masterful performance with whatever amateur fumbling she could manage. "Bravo!" called out one of the older students. "That was incredible." "Thank you," Richard said graciously, though his eyes were already fixed on Carmen. "That, class, is what 25 years of professional training sounds like. Notice the control, the precision, the complete mastery of the instrument." He gestured toward the piano bench with exaggerated courtesy. "Carmen, the stage is yours. Please don't feel pressured to match what you just heard. Just do your best." Carmen opened her eyes and looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Was that sympathy? Impossible. She was probably just nervous about embarrassing herself in front of all these people. "That was very skillful," she said quietly as she approached the piano. "You clearly know the piece well." "Indeed I do," Richard replied with a smug smile. "I've performed it with some of the world's finest orchestras. It's one of my signature pieces." Carmen nodded and sat down at the bench. She adjusted it slightly, and not dramatically like Richard had done, but with the small unconscious movements of someone who knew exactly what they needed. She placed her hands on the keys but didn't begin playing immediately. "What will you be playing for us, Carmen?" asked the kind student who had spoken to her earlier. Carmen was quiet for a moment, her fingers resting lightly on the keys. "Chopin," she said finally. "Ballad number 1 in G minor." Richard nearly choked. The Chopin Ballad number 1 was one of the most technically and emotionally demanding pieces in the entire piano repertoire. It was a piece that separated true masters from merely competent players. Surely she didn't think she could actually play it. "Are you certain about that choice?" he asked, unable to keep the condescension out of his voice. "That's quite an ambitious selection. Perhaps something simpler would be more appropriate." Carmen looked at him steadily. "You said I could choose anything I wanted." "Well, yes, but then I choose this." The students leaned forward in their seats. Even they knew the reputation of the piece Carmen had selected. This was either going to be spectacular or spectacularly embarrassing. Carmen closed her eyes again and took a slow, deep breath. For a moment, the entire hall was silent except for the distant hum of the air conditioning and the quiet rustling of the students shifting in their seats. Then she began to play. The first notes of the Chopin Ballade emerged from the piano like a whispered secret. But these weren't just notes. They were something else entirely. Where Richard's playing had been technically perfect but emotionally distant, Carmen's playing was like liquid emotion poured directly into sound. The melody began soft and contemplative, each note carefully placed not for technical showmanship, but for maximum emotional impact. Carmen's touch on the keys was different from Richard's. Lighter, more nuanced, more personal. It was as if she wasn't just playing the piano, she was having a conversation with it. Richard felt his confident smile begin to fade. This wasn't what he had expected at all. Carmen's technique was, well, it was flawless. But more than that, she was making the piano sing in a way that his own performance, for all its technical perfection, had never quite achieved. As the piece progressed, Carmen's playing became more confident, more expressive. The gentle opening theme gave way to more complex passages, and she navigated them not just with skill, but with an understanding that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside the music itself. Her fingers moved across the keys with an ease that made the most difficult passages look effortless. The students were mesmerized. They had been impressed by Richard's technical display. But this was something entirely different. This was music that reached inside your chest and squeezed your heart. Several of them were leaning so far forward they were practically falling out of their chairs. Richard watched in growing amazement and horror. This woman, this janitor who cleaned floors and dusted piano benches, was playing with a level of artistry that he had spent his entire career trying to achieve. Her interpretation of the Chopin wasn't just technically perfect. It was deeply, profoundly musical in a way that his own playing had never been. But it was more than just skill. There was something in Carmen's playing that spoke of real experience, real understanding of what the music meant. When she reached the dramatic middle section of the ballade, her playing became passionate and intense, but never lost its perfect control. She wasn't just executing the notes, she was telling a story. Richard found himself thinking about his own performance just minutes earlier. Yes, it had been technically perfect. Every note in the right place, every phrase properly shaped. But, listening to Carmen play, he realized that his performance had been like reading a poem in a foreign language, correct but without understanding. Carmen's playing, on the other hand, was like hearing that same poem spoken by someone who had lived every word of it. As she approached the climactic section of the piece, Carmen's entire body seemed to become part of the music. Her hands moved with incredible speed and precision, but there was no sense of strain or effort. She made the piano sound like it was singing, crying, laughing, all at the same time. The students were completely silent now, afraid to even breathe. This wasn't just a piano lesson anymore. This was something magical, something that none of them would ever forget. And Richard? Richard stood frozen, watching his entire worldview crumble with every note that flowed from Carmen's fingers. The music that flowed from Carmen's fingers wasn't just beautiful, it was transformative. As she moved deeper into the Chopin Ballade, The entire atmosphere of the concert hall seemed to shift. The ornate chandeliers above cast a softer glow. The red velvet seats seemed to lean in closer, and even the air itself felt charged with something electric. Richard stood paralyzed, watching this impossible scene unfold before his eyes. Every fiber of his being wanted to deny what he was witnessing, but the evidence was right there in front of him. This woman, this cleaning lady who he had dismissed so carelessly, was playing with a level of artistry that made his own performance seem shallow and hollow by comparison. Carmen's hands moved across the keys with an almost supernatural grace. The most challenging passages, the ones that had taken Richard years to master, flowed from her fingers like water. But it wasn't just the technical skill that left him stunned. It was the emotion, the depth, the sheer humanity that she poured into every single note. The students were completely mesmerized. Jessica, the young woman who had been kind to Carmen earlier, had tears streaming down her face. She wasn't the only one. Several other students were openly weeping, caught up in the raw emotion of Carmen's performance. Even the tough-looking guy in the back row, who usually acted too cool for classical music, was staring at the stage with his mouth hanging open. As Carmen reached the heart of the piece, her playing became even more intense. The melody soared and dipped, whispered and roared, painting pictures in sound that no words could ever capture. She played like someone who had lived through every emotion the music contained: joy and sorrow, hope and despair, love and loss, all woven together in perfect harmony. Richard felt something breaking inside his chest. For 25 years, he had thought he understood what it meant to be a musician. He had studied at the finest schools, won prestigious competitions, performed on the world's greatest stages. He had built his entire identity around being the best, around being superior to everyone else. But watching Carmen play, he realized that everything he thought he knew about music was wrong. He had spent his career perfecting his technique, polishing his sound, making sure every note was exactly where it should be. He had turned music into a science, a mathematics of sound that could be measured and judged and ranked. Carmen, on the other hand, was making music into something else entirely. She was making it into truth. The way she shaped each phrase wasn't about showing off her skill. It was about sharing something deep and personal and real. When she played the gentle passages, you could feel tenderness and love. When she played the dramatic sections, you could sense struggle and triumph. This wasn't just someone playing notes on a piano. This was someone opening their soul and letting everyone else peek inside. Richard found himself thinking about his own life, his own journey with music. When had he stopped feeling and started just performing? When had the joy been replaced by pride? When had music become a weapon he used to prove his superiority instead of a gift he shared with others? Carmen was approaching the climactic section of the piece now, and her playing became even more extraordinary. Her fingers flew across the keys with impossible speed and precision, but there was no sense of strain or effort. She made the most difficult passages look easy, not because she was showing off, but because she was so completely in tune with the music that the technical challenges simply disappeared. The piano itself seemed transformed under her touch. Richard had played this same instrument just minutes earlier, but somehow Carmen was making it sound like a completely different piano. It was richer, warmer, more alive. Every note rang with perfect clarity, but also with perfect emotion. One of the students, a serious-looking young man named David, who rarely spoke in class, suddenly whispered, "Oh my God." His voice was barely audible, but in the silence of the hall everyone heard him. No one shushed him or looked annoyed. They all understood exactly how he felt. Richard's legs felt weak. He had to lean against the wall to keep from falling down. This was beyond anything he had ever experienced. Carmen wasn't just playing the piano, she was channeling something divine, something that touched the very core of what music was supposed to be. As the piece moved toward its conclusion, Carmen's playing became even more magical. The melody, lines intertwined and separated, danced around each other, created harmonies that seemed to hang in the air like perfume. She was telling a story without words, painting a picture without colors, expressing things that could only be expressed through music. The students were completely silent now, afraid that even the smallest sound might break the spell. Some of them were crying openly. Others sat with their eyes closed, lost in the beauty of what they were hearing. Even the security guard had quietly slipped into the back of the hall, drawn by the incredible sounds coming from the stage. Richard realized that his face was wet. He was crying too, but he didn't care. Something inside him was breaking apart and rebuilding itself all at the same time. 25 years of arrogance and pride were crumbling away, replaced by something he had almost forgotten existed: humility. Carmen played the final section with such tenderness and grace that it felt like a prayer. Each note was placed with perfect care, not for technical effect, but for emotional impact. She wasn't trying to impress anyone or prove anything. She was simply sharing something beautiful, something true, something that came from the deepest part of her being. As the last notes began to fade, the silence in the hall was absolute. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Nobody dared to break the magic of what had just happened. Carmen sat at the piano with her eyes still closed, her hands resting quietly on the keys, looking peaceful and serene. The silence stretched on, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was sacred. Everyone in the room knew they had just witnessed something extraordinary, something that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. Finally, slowly, Carmen opened her eyes and looked out at the audience. Her face was calm and gentle, showing no sign of pride or arrogance. She had just delivered one of the most incredible piano performances any of them had ever heard, but she looked exactly the same as she had when she was dusting the piano bench earlier. Richard stared at her in complete amazement. This woman had just turned his entire world upside down, and she looked like she was ready to go back to her cleaning cart and continue with her work day. And then, like a dam bursting, the applause began. But this wasn't polite, respectful clapping like Richard had received. This was thunderous, emotional, overwhelming applause that seemed to come from the very souls of everyone in the room. The students leaped to their feet, clapping and cheering and crying all at the same time. They had come to learn about music, but they had just experienced something far beyond any lesson. And Richard? Richard clapped harder than anyone else, his heart full of emotions he couldn't even name. The applause seemed to go on forever. Students were on their feet, clapping until their hands hurt, some still wiping tears from their eyes. The sound echoed through the grand hall like thunder, but Carmen sat quietly at the piano, looking almost embarrassed by all the attention. Richard found himself clapping harder than he had ever clapped in his life. His hands stung, his arms ached, but he couldn't stop. Something fundamental had shifted inside him during those 20 minutes of music, and he felt like a completely different person than the arrogant man who had walked into this hall just hours earlier. Finally, the applause began to die down, and Carmen stood up from the piano bench. She smoothed down her simple gray uniform and started to walk back toward her cleaning cart, as if nothing extraordinary had just happened. "Wait," Richard called out, his voice cracking slightly. "Please don't go." Carmen stopped and turned around, her expression gentle but cautious. "I should really get back to my work. I've already taken up too much of your class time." "No," Richard said firmly, stepping forward. "No, you haven't taken up anything. You've given us something incredible." He paused, struggling to find the right words. "Carmen, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. Who are you really?" Carmen looked at him for a long moment, then glanced at the students who were all watching her with amazement and curiosity. She seemed to be weighing her words carefully. "I'm exactly who I said I am," she replied softly. "I work here. I clean these halls, dust these chairs, polish this piano." "But that's not all you are," Richard pressed. "Nobody plays like that without years of professional training. Decades of it. That was one of the most beautiful performances I've ever heard in my life." Several students nodded in agreement. Jessica, the kind young woman, stepped forward. "Carmen, that was absolutely incredible. Where did you learn to play like that?" Carmen was quiet for a long time, her eyes fixed on the piano. When she finally spoke, her voice was so soft they all had to lean in to hear her. "I used to be a professional pianist. she said simply. The words hung in the air like a revelation. Richard felt his legs go weak again. Used to be? What do you mean? Carmen walked slowly back toward the piano, running her fingers along its polished surface. A long time ago, I performed with orchestras. I gave recitals, made recordings, toured around the world. Music was my whole life. What happened? David asked gently. Carmen's eyes grew distant, as if she was looking back through years of memory. Life happened. My daughter was born with severe disabilities. She needed constant care, constant attention, the doctors, the treatments, the special schools. It all cost so much money. She paused, her hand still resting on the piano. My husband couldn't handle it. He left when Isabella was 3 years old. Suddenly, I was a single mother with a disabled child and no steady income. Concert pianists don't make much money unless they're at the very top, and I couldn't travel anymore anyway. Richard felt a crushing weight in his chest. So you gave up music? I gave up performing, Carmen corrected. But I never gave up music. When I heard about the job here at the music hall, I knew it was perfect. I could work during the day to support my daughter, and at night after everyone went home. She smiled softly. At night I could still play. You practice here? Jessica asked, her voice full of wonder. Carmen nodded. Every night for 15 years. After I finish cleaning, after everyone leaves, I come back and play for a few hours. Just me and the piano in the empty hall. She looked around at all the faces watching her. Music has been my companion through everything. The good times and the bad times, the lonely nights and the difficult days. Richard was struggling to process everything he was hearing. But Carmen, you're incredibly talented. You could have a career again. You could be performing in concert halls around the world. Carmen shook her head gently. My daughter needs me. She's 20 now, but she'll always need care. Besides, I'm happy with my life. I have my work. I have my music. And most importantly, I have Isabella. Not everyone needs to be famous to be fulfilled. But don't you miss it? Asked one of the other students. The applause, the recognition, the chance to share your gift with the world? Carmen considered this for a moment. I do share my gift, she said finally. Every night when I play in this empty hall, I'm sharing it with the music itself. And today I got to share it with all of you. That's more than enough for me. Richard felt tears streaming down his face again. Carmen, I owe you an enormous apology. The way I treated you today, the things I said, I was horrible to you. You didn't know, Carmen said simply. But that's not an excuse, Richard insisted. I judged you based on your job, your appearance, without knowing anything about who you really are. I was arrogant and cruel, and you didn't deserve any of it. Carmen studied his face for a moment. You know what the difference is between us, Richard? What? You play to prove how good you are. I play because I love the music. She smiled gently. But there's no reason you can't learn to do both. The students were listening to every word, absorbing lessons that went far beyond piano technique. Richard realized that this had become the most important masterclass of his career, even though he wasn't the one teaching it. Carmen, he said slowly, would you consider teaching? Maybe giving master classes here at the hall? I know people who would pay anything to learn from someone who plays like you do. Carmen shook her head. I'm not a teacher. I'm just someone who loves music. But that's exactly what makes you a great teacher, Jessica said eagerly. You just taught us more about music in 20 minutes than we've learned in months of regular lessons. She's right, Richard said. Carmen, what you have isn't just technical skill. It's wisdom. It's understanding. It's everything that I've been missing in my own playing. Carmen looked around at all their hopeful faces. I appreciate the offer, but I have responsibilities. My daughter, my job. What if we could work around that? Richard asked desperately. What if you could teach just one master class a month? On your schedule, at your convenience? For the first time, Carmen looked genuinely tempted. I don't know. It's been so long since I taught anyone. Please, Richard said. Let me learn from you. Let all of us learn from you. You've shown us what music can really be. Carmen was quiet for a long time, her eyes moving from face to face, seeing the genuine hope and admiration in each one. Finally, she smiled. Maybe, she said softly. Maybe we could try that. And in that moment, Richard realized that he had learned the most important lesson of his career. True greatness isn't about being better than others. It's about lifting others up along with you.